Welcome back to Not Off Projects. Today we are back on this 1999 Triumph Daytona 955i. Last time we were working on it, we got it running and chased down a bunch of weird electrical issues after it had been sitting for a number of years. There was an odd noise in the engine that was a little bit concerning. So we're gonna tear into the engine a little bit, make sure all is happy there, and hopefully get this bike to the point where it's completely drivable mechanically. So let's start tearing in and see what kind of trouble we get into. Let's get to the bottom of this noise. I think a good starting point would be to get the cam cover off. That way we can get a good look at the timing chain along with the valve adjustment. The noise did kind of sound like it was coming down maybe a little lower, like maybe the balance shaft chain, but I don't know if they're the same chain or not on this, but we'll see. Let's get the cover off. Who knows the last time this thing had a valve adjustment either, so it'd be good to check that. This will just pop up, give it a little bit of help. Get something a little sturdier. Not sure what the best way is to sneak this out. Trying not to tear this gasket because I don't have any one. Already the timing chain seems like it's fine. That's shoehorned in there. Still seems okay. Nice and clean in there. Really clean, actually. So that's good. Dropped a little bit of junk down in here to clean up, but you can see if the timing chain were slapping around, we would have a lot more slack than that, which is no slack. So we'll double check our valve clearances. That's not going to be the problem. It's too loud to be that, so that pushes us down further. So I believe the spec for this on the intake is 4 to 6 thousandths, and then on the exhaust is 6 to 8 thousandths of an inch, or 0.1 millimeter to 0.15, and then 0.15 to 0.2, if I believe, or if I remember correctly. So we'll just go through and check, and how we rotate the engine over is we'll put it in the highest gear and just rotate the rear wheel, and obviously we just check when we are on the base circle. So this one is ready to check. So the exhaust is 6 to 8. Six fits fine there. 6 fits fine there. And then we'll check the 8. 8 does not. 8 is tight. So that one's at about the max range. It's still acceptable. So that's what I'm gonna go through and do on all of them. I just like to do it go, no go. Some guys get crazy and find out exactly what the clearance is for each valve. But if the 6 fits and the 8 doesn't, we're good. Or if the 4 fits and the 6 doesn't for the intake, we're good. So, all right, so we got one on the intake that's way too tight. A 1.5 thou feeler gauge, which you can see how thin that is. That is not even close to going in. So Unfortunately, we're gonna have to re-shim this. I don't have shims for it, so I'll have to try to get that. And you need a special tool to compress the spring enough to get the bucket out, or you get to compress the bucket enough to get the shim out, because these are shim on bucket, which means there's a removable piece of metal that sits on top of the bucket lifter, and varying the thickness of that piece is what gives you clearance. So all but 2 of our intake valves are way tight enough that my smallest feeler gauge won't fit, which is 1.5 thou. Some of them are so tight that, like this one's tight, but you may not be able to see. But the shim I can rotate by hand, you can see it. This one is tight enough that the shim won't rotate. So that means that there's some decent pressure, which means that the valve's hanging open a little bit, which means I was bleeding off compression, which means that you could burn a valve or just not have it run right. You could also bend valves if it got really extreme. We're not at that point, I wouldn't say. I don't think that's the noise we're hearing, unless it's kind of missing and it's rattling because of that, but it seemed to run okay-ish, so I don't think that's what our problem is. Let's push the bike forward and backward a little bit and listen for any loud knocking, which would be a loose piston. This may or may not be helpful, but well, there is something there. But it's hard to say if that's just backlash in the transmission. Maybe what we should do is drop the oil. If there's a rod knock, which I'm not convinced it would be a rod knock because it's not as loud as a rod knock usually is, then our oil is going to be really metallic-y. So we'll drop it, and if we like swirl our finger through it, there'll be a bunch of metal in it. I don't think we're dealing with a rod knock just because there was another issue that was keeping it off the road. Obviously, not the whole story, so it could be that it got parked for something catastrophic and then it lost spark due to the ECU problem. But I don't think that's the case. But let's drop our oil and see what it looks like. So here's our oil. That is exactly what we don't want to see. We have some kind of bearing failure, unfortunately. Luckily the oil pan isn't too bad to get to, so we can at least see what kind of carnage we got going on. Not ideal. I'm guessing the reason why that happened is maybe when the last guy was working on this, not to blame the last guy, it could have been before that, but obviously the side cover was off and maybe he was cranking it a whole bunch with it not having any oil, so it spun a bearing. I mean, we cranked a little bit, not a ton. I don't know. It doesn't really matter at this point. We definitely have something unhappy going on in there. Let's drop the oil pan. The only thing in our way of doing that is the exhaust, and the only thing in the way of doing the exhaust is the radiator and oil cooler. So looks like it's just held on with a couple bolts and then one down here. We just need to flop it out of the way a little bit. That way we can get to the nuts that hold the exhaust on. If we luck out, well, it's possible we luck out and the crank isn't totally trashed and we can put a new bearing on without doing anything. But that's probably wishful thinking. Hopefully the spun bearing happened while the previous guy / while I was turning it over recently without oil. Although I tried to limit that as much as possible. That's the best case scenario because then it hasn't run hardly at all with the bearing spun. So there's still probably bearing material and it's not connecting rod on crank, which is when things get nasty. Okay, that gives us a little bit more room to work, at least from my side. This nut was already loose. And there's one missing, so I don't know if it somehow rattled loose or if somebody's been here before. Alright, so we undo these springs, which I guess hold the pipes together. And I think that's all of the retaining hardware. There we go. Now we're clear to remove our oil pan. So we have our oil cooler fittings, and then we just have a bunch of these Torx bolts. So I'm going to take all those out, bring it back, and we'll hopefully have a better picture of what exactly is going on here. All right, so we have all of our bolts out, I believe. Now we gotta find somewhere to pry against. There's pry tabs, but nothing to pry against. Might need to just get the mallet. Although usually prying works better than hammering. All right, there we go. Is it just sealant holding this up? Certainly doesn't feel like it. Flashlight in there. Oh, I think we have to take this tube off. This is what feeds the oil cooler lines, or at least one side of it. Get our other copper washer. And I'm guessing we have one more line that we gotta deal with. How do we get to that? Wait, no, that's not it. Is it? Oh, I think it just has to pry out. I think we gotta get a screwdriver way down in there. Okay. More sadness. Not too much though, which is an encouraging sign. So you guys can probably see better than I can at this point. And then you gotta go into the prone position. Can't hardly see. I think one of the pistons, or the rods I mean, we can't see. So we can see two of the rods from below. Number 2 and 3, I believe, would be what they're numbered. Number 1, I think, is kind of hidden. I can't really see it. So hopefully it's number 2. I can't really tell by feeling, which kind of makes me think maybe it's number 1, because any major rod knock you'd be able to feel. Maybe it's just developing, and that's why it's not super loud yet. We'll probably want to pop off. Well, ideally we'd be able to get to all of them, pop all the caps off, replace all the bearings. You know, that's assuming there's a miracle that happens and they're not all toast. Or that all the crank journals aren't toast and need turned. But we will see. So what I'm doing is I'm popping the plugs out, and we're gonna stick a rod or something down and rock the bike. And whichever one is the rod knock one, it should move not at all while we take the slack out of the drivetrain. The other one should move a little bit. Let's start back here. That's too big. All right, so we're gonna drop this down the cylinder. It's hitting piston now, so. All of the big ends on the rods feel tight to the crank, so I pulled off the one that we could access, the center one. The bearing looks totally fine. Like, not even scuffed up or anything, so. I don't know, that's kind of weird. Generally, if you spin a rod bearing, they're all gonna look pretty cruddy, even if one only spins, but I don't know, that's pretty weird. I'm gonna have to think on this one for sure. So made some progress and thought some on this. I don't really think that it's bottom end related to the engine, that noise, because that one bearing looked really, really good, especially for the mileage. There's no big chunks or anything, and I can feel all of the connecting rod caps, and they're all tight. if we had a rod bearing that was throwing that much metal into the oil, it would be loose. So I don't think it's engine bottom end related. I think maybe that metal is from the clutch or possibly the transmission. There's a little bit of fine magnetic junk in the oil pan. Try to get it over. You can see it over there. Of course, now there's a little bit of oil in there, but you can see there's a little bit of crud in there. But this is also a magnet, and it's right under the gearbox. And I doubt the oil pan's ever been dropped, so that's probably just gearbox shavings, which is, you know, on a car that's pretty normal. So I would imagine on a bike it's not super abnormal, especially if it's 40,000 mile worth of accumulation. As for why the oil is kind of metallic-y, I don't know. Maybe it just settled, or who knows. But I don't think it's bottom end related, at least at this point. Another thing that came to mind is half of our exhaust manifold nuts were loose or missing. So part of the noise could be some exhaust leaks, which will cause ticking. And it was kind of coming from that area, like halfway mid down the engine. I don't know why I didn't think about that earlier, but hopefully that's it. Now, one thing that is a problem that could be contributing to our hard starting and like weird running is the tight valve clearances. So I already pulled the shims out that are tight. They're shim on bucket. So I think I've already showed this, but they're a shim that fits on top of the lifter. They make different thicknesses, so I just assumed that there's zero lash in all the ones that I can't get a 1.5 thou feeler gauge in. So let me show you. So here are the shims. There's one that I put back in so that we could rotate the engine over. These are the current thickness of the shims, and then that is our max valve lash, which I'd rather be at the max spec if these valves are tightening up. So we add 0.15 millimeter, or subtract 0.15 millimeter from the current shims, and that's the set of shims that we need to get for the motor. And it looks like I can get them on eBay, so I'll order these. They're not super expensive, so if the engine's still toast for whatever reason, no harm, no foul, really. And we'll put those in, button the engine back up, actually put some nuts in the exhaust, and I guess see what it does. So yeah. Now that I'm reasonably confident that our noise is not bottom end related, I'm getting ready to button it back up. I did actually pull the alternator because apparently that's a known source of a rattle on these things. It has these little rubber cushion noise damper things that go around that spline that sticks into these splines here. Kind of a funky setup. There's only 3 of them on this. I don't know if it comes with 4 or if the previous owner, or if at some point in the bike's life one of them was lost, but you know, 3 is pretty good. 3 out of 4 is not bad. So anyways, the what happens on these apparently is the nut comes loose on the alternator and that'll rattle. It's not loose on this, so that's not our source. Also, apparently some unlucky people have the bearings that support this shaft go loose, or the balls basically blow up and fall out of the transmission. These ones feel good. It doesn't feel like that's where the sound's coming from. I did find one thing that we are going to check out, and that is the timing chain. So before we looked at it and it was nice and tight. I've got it at a different point in its travel, and you can see there's actually a fair bit of looseness on it. More than I would like to see. So we're going to see if this tensioner needs any adjustment. I think what you can do is back it out, back the bolts out just a hair and let it ratchet out. One more click just to take up a little bit more slack, but we'll see on that. You know what, looking at it in a different point, I think the cam chain tension is okay. There's like a little bit of looseness. There's always a point or two in the cam/crank travel where the chain loosens up a little bit, and we were looking at it in one of those spots. If we still are fighting some kind of weird noise issues and it sounds like it's a cam chain, what we may end up doing is popping these bolts out just a hair, letting the tensioner ratchet out one click, tightening it back down, and that'll take a little bit more slack out. But I think for now we'll run it as is and see what happens. So what I'm going to do now is retorque our connecting rod that we loosened up, number 2, which technically, according to the service manual, you're supposed to replace the rod bolts, which I've never even heard of before. I mean, on modern engines, sure, where they thread into the actual connecting rod, but these are like press fit connecting rod bolts, so we're not going to replace them. They're supposedly torque to yield. I think it's like 15 newton meters or 10 newton meters, and then another 120 degrees. So I'm gonna torque them up, and if they feel weird, then yeah, we'll have to figure out how to source some of those, but I think they'll be okay. And then I'm gonna put the oil pan back up and on. It's awkward to get you in there anyways, so you're not gonna miss out on much. I'll put the side panel back on. I think I'm gonna put the OEM cam sensor on, because this one does not seal very good onto the case and was actually leaking oil. So that's gonna get replaced with the original one, and we're gonna probably put some sealant on the rubber grommet on the inside just to keep any oil seepage down. So, and then I'll replace this cover, which you already saw before. I'll replace the other side cover, and then we'll just be waiting on our replacement shims to show up. So I'll bring you back once we got shims to put in. So we got our new shims in. Here they are. Hopefully our math checks out. We're gonna find out. So let's start popping these in. This one I have in right now because we needed to turn against it, if that makes sense. So let's pop this one in. So they make a special tool for this. I think I may have mentioned this already, but they make a special tool for this, and people also remove the cams. But I found if you just are careful with the screwdriver, you can put it onto the lifter. Put your weight onto the screwdriver. Pop it down, and it slides right in. Taking it out's a little harder, but it's not that hard. The hardest part is that the oil suctions the shim to the lifter, so you got to push it down and simultaneously use a pick to pry it up. But the lifter buckets seem to be really hard metal, so I didn't mark them up at all or anything using a screwdriver. So I believe our spec was 4 to 6 thousandths on the intakes. I may have erred a little bit on the loose side. No, 6 is tight. 4, so actually I could have gone a little bit more, but it's probably at 4 thousandths right now, so it's on the lower end of acceptable. Whoops, but whatever. It's better than it was, that's no doubt. So I'm just gonna put all the shims in. All of them were about that tight, so they should all be at about 4 thousandths, but we're gonna double check. And then we will get our cam cover on and hopefully be off to the races. Okay, so we have a couple valves, number 1 and number 2. They are a couple thousandths tight, maybe 1 thousandth tight. So I'll have to order in looser shims. I assumed that they were at 0 lash and went up from there. So probably they were hanging open a couple thousandths, which is not great, but hopefully they're not burned or anything, and that might solve the dying issue and hard starting. So now I'm just gonna button it up. We're just gonna put the cam cover back on, and basically that's it. We'll put the airbox on, but you've seen that a couple thousand times at this point. I'm also going to replace these fuel lines because they were leaking at the union. And these are probably original, so we'll replace those and then hopefully take it for a ride. Hopefully that sound is gone now that I tightened down the exhaust, but we'll see. Alright, so we're also going to replace our fuel lines like I mentioned. So we got some new fuel injection rated 3/8 and 1/4 inch hose. You want to make sure to use on fuel injection line that really needs clamped down when you use this type of clamp, because it applies even pressure all the way around the hose, versus you can see somebody put a normal style worm drive clamp on and you can see how it digs into the hose. No good. So I'm going to replace those, and then we should be good to get our airbox and fuel tank back on. Alright, so let's fire it up and see. Hopefully I got the fuel lines oriented right. But find out. It's not neutral either. Yep. On for something. I probably forgot to plug something in, or it might be a stored code. There's a little bit of a clatter maybe, but I don't know, maybe it's normal on these. I've heard they're loud motors. Alright, let's take it up and down the driveway. I think it's going to be a whole lot better now that it's not dying, and that it should just start up without throttle this time. Alright, so we have our new thermostat housing. I just put it on because it's the 3 hoses and you've seen everything 10 times at this point. Lucked out and got this used for only 150 bucks, which is insane, but all the alternatives were like 700 bucks, if you can believe it. So you can see this one, all of that was eroded away. So our cap wasn't making a very good seal, and it was spraying coolant everywhere, along with this being cracked, along with that being cracked. So this is junk. But now we seem to be good. It's building pressure in the cooling system, which is what we want. So I think we need to test drive it. All right, so I think the Triumph is pretty much good to go mechanically. Seems to be running like a top. There is still that weird clatter noise, but apparently it's normal for these. I don't know. We'll see if it blows up here in 100 miles or whatever, but so far it's running great. On the way over to Mexico here, this thing rips hard. Definitely can kill yourself very easy, but let's do a little bit of running around here and see how it does. All right, so far all is good. So I think that's all we got to do this time. Next time we're going to be going through and doing all of the exterior bits. All the fairings are pretty much cracked and we have a bunch of parts to rebuild. Until then, I will see you guys next time.